The first time I saw that thermos, it was lying on its side in a rock gash so narrow you had to breathe shallow to keep from scraping your ribs. A thin beam of afternoon sun found the engraving on the stainless steel and made the initials blink VL. It was clean where it shouldn't have been, as if it had spent years hidden from weather and only recently been shaken loose. The metal felt cold even in warm air. I turned it in my hands and heard a faint rattle like a dry seed trapped where water couldn't reach. That little sound carried farther in my memory than any shout I ever sent down a ridge. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Most days back then ran on the same rails. I'd park the green Forest Service truck beside the old brick ranger station in Elkins just before 7 a.m., when Main Street still smelled like bacon grease and coffee drifting out of the diner. The radio would crackle once or twice with trail reports from night crews, blown limbs on a spur road, a gate to rechain a black bear sighting near a campground that meant more curiosity than danger. If the morning stayed quiet, I'd do a run out toward Spruce Knob, the high point of our state, where the wind can comb the red spruce in long, patient strokes and the air tastes like iron and resin. October is our show month. Leaves turn to fire, and city folks arrive in rental cars with new boots and big plans, swearing they'll be off trail by 4. I'd learned to love the routine. You don't take for granted what a small town gives you a nod from the hardware store owner when he sees you snag zip ties for trail signage, a wave from the bus driver who knows you've asked the same group of teenagers to stop building rock stacks in the creek, the postmaster who sets your package on the counter before you even give your name. Autumn settles into the bones here. Temperatures fall off a cliff after sundown, 60s in the afternoon, 30s by midnight, and the wind skates along the ridgelines as if it's got places to be. Tourists call it brisk. We call it normal. The first time I crossed paths with the Langleys, not formally just in passing, was 2 days before the date that has its own drawer in my desk now. I was checking signage near a trailhead, tightening a bolt on a faded mileage board. A dark SUV eased in, newer than what you typically see out here. The driver rolled down his window and asked about loop times in a voice that had the polish of someone used to being heard. He wore a navy fleece that looked to be more catalog than field-tested mirrored sunglasses that kept his eyes to himself. The woman in the passenger seat leaned over and smiled the way people do when they're comfortable everywhere, hair pulled back, the kind of calm you only see on distance runners and ICU nurses. I gave them the standard spiel: 3 hours if you keep moving water at the car. Only cell service, spotty sun goes down fast once the hill takes it. He nodded with a tight efficiency. She said thank you, like she meant it. They drove off toward the gravel, and I went back to my wrench. I didn't learn their names until later, of course, Victor and Elise, but I can still see the way the late light slid over their windshield as they turned and the tiny flare from the driver's watch when he checked the time. Details like that go into your head and wait. In the days leading up to October 12th, the forest moved through its greatest hits. Maple and oak put on their red and gold. The boardwalk at Cranberry Glades creaked under light foot traffic, and the bog orchids gone to seed rattled when the wind pushed across the open. We prepped for a busier weekend, checked batteries in our headlamps, staged a couple of extra water cans in the back of my truck, taped up a note near the visitor center, reminding folks that the temperature swings hard once shadows thicken. That's the rhythm. Anticipate what will go wrong before it does, because when it does all at once. My own evenings were quiet. The older you get in this line of work, the more you learn to let quiet be good enough. I'd go home to a small house on a street that still has a porch culture. Neighbors sit out with their dogs. Kids on bikes negotiate rules that keep them out of the road. My porch lamp is one of those glass lanterns with a little brass finial on top, and once the clock slips past 6 in October, it throws a cone of warm light across the steps. I'd set out my boots to dry by the heater, flip through reports at the kitchen table, and call my sister down in Charleston to hear about her day. We talk about small things. A new fence post she put in straight our mother's favorite soup recipe. It's a way to prove to ourselves that the center holds. If you want a sense of who we are out here, listen to a trailhead in the hour after sunrise. The grind of gravel under tires, doors thumping shut, the soft thud of a cooler being dragged from a trunk. That morning, the one that matters now, there were more rentals than usual, more out-of-state plates. It was mild for mid-October, high 50s by noon, the sky clear but thin, in that way you learn to read is brittle. I made my rounds with a thermal mug in the cup holder and a checklist on the dashboard. Mile markers solid. A downed red spruce cleared with the help of a crew that still smelled like diesel and sap. You could stand at the overlook and see rows of hills stacked up in shades of blue like folded quilts. The kind of day that makes people underestimate night. At some point in the early afternoon, I caught a reflection off a camera lens as a couple took a photo at a bend in the trail. I was 100 feet away and didn't intrude. They were smiling with that dialed-in confidence of people used to making plans and keeping them. He had on that navy fleece. She had a thin headband catching wisps of hair near her ears. I remember thinking, good shoes, they'll do fine. I drove on to check a gate off an old logging spur. There's a thing that happens in the late day up here. Not a storm, not a sign, just a feeling like the light pauses before it slides into evening. On clear days, it's beautiful, like the forest takes a breath. On other days, you sense the moment the comfort drains out of it. If you've worked enough seasons, you catch it in small tells. A squirrel goes quiet. The woodpecker you've been hearing in a stand of beech trees moves farther off. And you ask yourself, do I have what I need if someone calls by a little before 5 I was back near town? I stopped into the diner to grab a sandwich I didn't need and answer a question from a retired teacher about leaf timing on the ridge he likes. He uses a cane now, but his mind maps our trails better than some of our new hires. He laughed about his glory days, tapped his cane toward the window and said, "You keep folks honest out there, Clara." It's the kind of line that makes you straighten your shoulders, even when you'd rather go home and put your feet up. I paid with a 5 and a couple of ones from the coffee jar and walked out into the kind of early evening that turns every windshield into a mirror. I swung through the station to file a quick note, downed tree-cleared signpost, resecured one minor erosion rut, flagged for repair. Our desk phone rang twice around 6 and went quiet. The radio stayed calm. I made a mental tally of my flashlight inventory, a habit like locking the door twice. At 6:30, the sun went soft behind the hills. You could feel the temperature step down 5 degrees in as many minutes. I thought about the signs we post each season. Plan your turnaround time. Daylight is not a guarantee. People read it, but the forest teaches lessons its own way. Across town, the motel's neon switch would have clicked over to vacancy, the transformer buzzing as it warmed. I've never liked that sound at night, too much like a fluorescent light in an empty hallway. A few minutes after that, one of our newer rangers, a careful guy who's quick with a map, leaned into my office doorway and asked if I wanted the last coffee from the pot. I said no. I told him to dump it and start fresh for the morning. Burnt coffee breeds bad decisions after dark. He grinned and did as he was told. I signed one last form and slid it into a folder already thick with October. Around 7, the air carried that clean metallic edge that tells you the thermometer's dropping toward the 30s once the sky goes fully black. The streetlights clicked on along Randolph Avenue. Porch lamps followed one by one as if the town gave a collective nod to night's arrival. I phoned the duty cell to do a standard check-in. No open calls, no hikers overdue by a posted time, a couple of folks asking what trail is best for tomorrow. Good. All right. I drove home with the window cracked enough to smell the leaf litter working itself toward soil. On my block, a neighbor 2 doors down was sweeping his porch. He lifted his chin in that silent hello men of his generation seemed to prefer. I parked, killed the engine, and listened to the sudden quiet that's always bigger than you expect after a day of engines and chatter. Inside, I set my boots by the heater and turned the porch lantern on, out of muscle memory. I laid my radio on the kitchen counter. It made a small plastic sound and went still. If I could go back to that exact minute, I'd pay attention to something else, something ordinary that didn't register at the time. Maybe the dog across the street, usually loud at dinner time, was asleep. Maybe the wind swung around from the west a little early. Maybe a train horn down in the valley was one long note instead of the usual 2. It's always like that. What matters later hides inside what felt unimportant then. I warmed a bowl of soup. I flipped open a copy of the trail work plan for the following week, water bars, to clean a rotten footbridge to pull. The porch light threw that steady cone across the steps and picked up the dust on my truck's hood. It's a comfort, that circle of light, the way it says, "Here," to anyone trying to find you. At 7:15, the telephone didn't ring, which is the most normal thing in the world until it isn't. By 7:25, I stood at the sink and looked out the window at the quiet street, listening for a car I couldn't hear. A moth tapped the glass twice and drifted off toward the lantern. I shut the faucet and waited a beat. I can still feel in my chest. Somewhere out past the last porch light down the 2-lane that runs toward the high country, a pair of headlights should have swung across a motel wall and spilled into a room with 2 neatly made beds. Instead, the road held its breath, and the night slipped a degree colder. I left my radio on the counter and kept the porch light burning a little longer than usual. I left the porch light burning that night longer than I meant to. Something in the air felt restless, like the wind couldn't decide which direction to take. I just started rinsing out my soup bowl when the station line rang. The sound was sharp in the quiet house, the kind that freezes you mid-motion. On the other end was dispatch voice, steady but urgent. A woman was at the ranger post, said her parents hadn't come back from a day hike. I told them I was 5 minutes out. I drove through town with the window cracked, cold air knifing in. When I pulled into the gravel lot, the lights from the ranger station spilled across the blacktop like thin milk. A young woman stood near the door, arms wrapped tight, a phone pressed to her chest. "You must be Miss Langley," I said as I got out. She nodded once. Her name was Marissa. 24, eyes red but dry. She told me her parents, Victor and Elise, had left that morning for what was supposed to be a short loop near Spruce Knob. 3 hours, she said. They promised they'd be back by 5. The Range Rover was still sitting outside their motel room, keys gone, but luggage untouched. Their phones had stopped ringing by dusk. We went through the routine questions, trail name, gear, any health issues, but what struck me was her precision. She knew what they packed, what they wore, even the exact time her father had texted a photo, 1:17 p.m. That kind of detail usually meant denial hadn't set in yet. I asked for the picture. She showed me the screen, 2 smiling faces against a backdrop of trees turning gold. They looked capable, prepared, confident. It didn't make sense, but it rarely does in those first hours. I told her we'd start a night search right away. By 8 o'clock, I had 6 rangers, 2 volunteers, and a K-9 team geared up at the trailhead. The cold was already biting down, temperature just above freezing. Headlamps scattered across the dark like scattered stars. I gave a quick briefing, short and clear, follow the main loop check the Spurs call out every 15 minutes. We logged each pair of boots that stepped off the gravel. As I watched the lights move into the tree line, I remember thinking how quickly sound disappears in those woods. A few minutes after the last voice faded, all that was left was the wind rolling over dry leaves and the hum of the generator by my truck. The first hours of any search are a fight between hope and math. People think getting lost happens because of confusion or panic, but more often it's timing. A small mistake made too close to dark, a trail that splits just where the map blurs. Still, Victor and Elise weren't typical tourists. According to Marissa, they had satellite gear, a beacon, and years of hiking experience. I called their numbers myself, straight to voicemail. We checked the vehicle again, no damage, no signs they'd driven elsewhere. 1 water bottle in the cup holder half full. I logged it all, even the small things that might never matter. By 10 p.m., fog began to crawl in from the lower ridges, thick and slow. Radios crackled with check-ins, negative tracks, no sign moving east of the spur. I told teams to hold the line until midnight. Beyond that, visibility would be useless. Back at the trailhead, Marissa sat on the hood of her car with a blanket one of the volunteers had given her. She asked if this kind of thing happened often. I told her we found most folks by morning. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She nodded, watching the tree line like it might answer back. At midnight, the teams returned with nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, not even the glint of a dropped wrapper. We marked the coordinates of every turn, every creek crossing, then shut down until first light. I drove back to the station, filed the overnight log, and sat for a long time staring at the topo maps pinned to the wall. The trail they'd chosen wasn't especially dangerous, but the terrain beyond it, Devil's Hollow, steep and tangled, was no place for night travel. I left a note for morning cruise and went home to grab an hour of sleep. The porch light was still on when I pulled into the drive moth spinning slow circles around the glass. By dawn, reinforcements had arrived from 2 counties over. Helicopter support from the state police, fresh volunteers, dogs rested and fed. We split the search grid into 4 sectors expanding outward 10 miles. From the air, the forest looked endless, a rippling ocean of color with no landmarks strong enough to hold on to. I rode in the chopper's rear seat headset, muffling the roar eyes scanning for anything that broke pattern. Bright gear disturbed canopy movement. All we found were deer paths and a few old campsites buried in leaves. Down below ground, teams worked creek beds and ravines, shouting names, marking waypoints. Mid-morning, one of the handlers called in a possible hit dog alert near a drainage basin. My boots hit mud within 15 minutes. It turned out to be the scent of an old campsite abandoned weeks before. Still, it made us check the area twice. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the wind seemed to stand still. That afternoon, I brought Marissa to the command post so she could see the operation. People sometimes need to witness the effort. It's the only way they believe we're doing all we can. She stood by the map board as I explained our radius, how each square of terrain was being cleared. She asked about bears, about caves, about the chance someone could have taken them. I told her we had to rule out the simple answers first. She mentioned her father had argued with some locals a year earlier about land rights for one of his developments. That made me pause. People in these parts hold grudges like family heirlooms, but speculation too early can poison a search. I thanked her for the information, wrote the names down quietly, and kept my focus on the grid. By sunset, 48 hours had passed. The math was getting colder by the hour. Night temperatures dropped to the low 30s, the kind that can turn damp clothing into ice. We set up tents for crews to rest in shifts. News trucks began parking along the roadside, their generators thrumming. Reporters shouted questions across the caution tape, words like foul play and ransom. I stepped between them and Marissa as she brought coffee to a few of my men, her face tight but composed. "They'll twist whatever you say," I told her quietly. She nodded, set the cups down, and went back to the motel to wait. On the 3rd morning, a volunteer from a neighboring county radioed in from a muddy incline about a quarter-mile off trail. He'd found something metallic partly buried in clay. I was there within 20 minutes. When I brushed away the dirt, I saw it was a keychain engraved clean despite the mud. The letters VE caught the sunlight. I showed it to Marissa. She pressed it into her palm and said it belonged to them. That small piece of proof hit her harder than any absence had. She cried for the first time, quiet and short, then asked what it meant. I didn't have an answer. The location didn't line up with their planned route, not even close. It was as if they'd left the trail by choice or had been led. We brought in more units, combed every ridge around that find. Nothing followed. No footprints, no torn fabric, no additional items. By that night, the mood had changed. Searchers moved slower. Conversations turned soft, resigned. I've seen it before. The forest starts to feel like a wall, not a wilderness. Every direction looks the same, and you start wondering if the missing were ever really there. Weeks blurred together. We covered ground until winter threatened snow. When command finally ordered a scale back, I didn't argue, but I stayed behind that evening while others packed the trucks. I walked to the edge of the ridge alone and looked down where the valleys folded in on each other. There are places in these hills where sound goes to die hollows so deep your own voice doesn't come back. I thought about Victor's photo, the way Elise's smile tilted toward him, and how quickly moments like that can vanish. In the months that followed, Marissa hired private search teams, drones, even a crew of climbers who worked the cliffs after snowmelt. Every time she came back to Elkins, she'd stop by the station to check in with me. She never blamed us, never raised her voice. She just kept asking if I believed they were still out there. I told her the same thing each time. I don't deal in belief. I deal in evidence. But I promised that if the mountain ever gave something back, she'd be the first to know. By the following spring, the file had thinned to a folder on a shelf. Reporters had moved on. People stopped asking. Only Marissa stayed tethered, returning on anniversaries to walk the trail with a guide leaving fresh flowers at the signpost near Spruce Knob. She said it made her feel closer to them. I didn't tell her it made me feel the opposite, that the forest seemed to close ranks tighter each year. 3 autumns later, I was finishing paperwork late in the day when my phone buzzed with a number from out of county. A young woman's voice introduced herself as a drone operator, said she'd found something strange near Cranberry Glades, metallic, maybe debris. She gave me coordinates. I copied them down, not thinking much of it. People report strange finds all the time, old mining tools, camping gear scrap. But something in her tone made me listen twice. She said the object had initials on it, letters visible through her camera feed. VL, she told me. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there a moment. The room felt smaller. I reached for the old folder and flipped it open to the first report. The keychain photo was still clipped to the inside cover edges, worn soft. I traced the letters with my thumb, VE, the last proof we ever had. I radioed for a small team, told them to meet me at dawn. Outside, the sky was that pale blue that comes right before night falls completely. I stood on the station steps and looked toward the dark line of mountains, still and indifferent. Somewhere out there, the forest had kept its secret for 3 long years. Tomorrow it might decide to speak. The next morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. Mist hung low over the ridges, and the forest looked like it was holding its breath. I was at the ranger station by 6 coffee, going cold beside a stack of old topo maps. The coordinates from the drone operator were circled in red. 12 miles south of the Langley trailhead, deep in a drainage known for flash floods and near vertical rock walls. I'd been in those woods 30 years, but that pocket of terrain was the kind you respected, the kind that never let you forget who was in charge. By 8, I had a team assembled, 2 rangers, a paramedic, and a young man named Nate Carver, one of the best cave rescue specialists I'd ever met. We loaded ropes, GPS units, and a lightweight drone of our own, then set out. The road into Cranberry Glades wound like a spine, narrow and slick from overnight rain. You could smell the wet leaves baking under the first trace of sun. The drone operators met us near the turnout where they'd been flying the day before. 2 college kids, nervous but earnest, with a small monitor hooked to their equipment. The girl showed me the footage, treetops rolling like green surf, then a sudden flash of silver wedged in a dark gorge. I froze the frame and zoomed in. It wasn't metal debris or trash. It was smooth, cylindrical, with a faint reflection along one side, engraving maybe. We packed what we needed and began the descent. The trail vanished within half a mile, swallowed by laurel thickets and deadfall. We cut through with machetes, marking trees with orange tape. The ground dropped steeply. 1 wrong step, and you'd slide 30 feet before you stopped. It took us 3 hours to reach the gorge. I remember how the air changed down there, cooler, denser, heavy, with the smell of stone and damp earth. The roar of a creek echoed somewhere out of sight. Nate spotted it first, a glint half buried in the mud beside a tangle of roots. He crouched, brushed it with his glove, and lifted it free. It was a thermos stainless steel, scuffed but intact. The initials were clear as day, VL. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I turned it over in my hands, noting the shallow dents, the rubber seal still firm. Whatever it had been through, it hadn't spent years baking in the open. That didn't make sense. The forest eats metal-fast rain, frost, humidity, but this one looked as if it had been sheltered somewhere and only recently washed out. I logged the coordinates and sealed it in an evidence bag. The kids who'd found it watched quietly. The girl asked if this meant the case was solved. I told her no, but it meant the mountain might finally be willing to talk. Back at the station, I sent the thermos straight to the state lab in Charleston. I've learned to temper hope, but I still checked my phone every hour for an update. It came 3 days later from a materials expert named Owen Kessler, a man whose voice always sounded like he was about to deliver bad news. He said the metal showed mild corrosion, nothing like what he'd expect after 3 years in the wild. The gasket was still pliable, as though it had been kept dry. Soil residue trapped in the threads contained pollen from an orchid species that only grew in the deepest hollows of the forest. In other words, the thermos had been stored somewhere hidden, protected from sunlight and weather, until something had forced it loose. That something turned out to be water. A hydrologist, Dr. Leah Monroe, joined our analysis. She pulled rainfall data from the past summer and pinpointed a storm in early July, 6 inches of rain in 4 hours. It had triggered slides, uprooted trees, and carved new channels through the lower valleys. She believed the flood had ripped through a cave or overhang, dislodging whatever was stored there and washing it downstream. Her model traced the path back to a natural basin called Devil's Hollow, a rugged section of cliffs and fissures 3 miles from where the thermos was found. I'd been there once before in the 90s for a rescue that turned into a recovery. The place earned its name honestly. We planned our entry 2 days later. Small team, no cameras, no media. The forest narrowed as we moved in trees leaning close, like they wanted to keep their secrets. We used Laya's flood maps to follow the storm's likely course up dry creek beds across slick boulders coated in moss. The higher we climbed, the quieter it became. By evening, we'd reached the mouth of Devil's Hollow. The light fell away fast, there swallowed by rock walls that seemed to rise straight out of the ground. We made camp near a limestone overhang, ate cold rations, and marked coordinates for the next morning. At dawn, fog crawled low through the hollow like smoke. Every sound boots on gravel metal clicks. The clink of carabiners seemed louder than it should. We searched one cave after another, shallow pockets carved into rock by centuries of water, nothing more than damp air and bat droppings. Hours passed. By mid-afternoon we were tired, mud-caked, and starting to think this lead might die like all the others. Then Nate, who had gone ahead a little way, called out softly. His voice carried that edge of disbelief you only hear when someone stumbles across a truth they weren't ready for. The fissure he'd found was barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and fallen limbs. It was narrow, so tight that you had to turn sideways to fit. Nate squeezed in first, his flashlight beam, cutting through darkness that had probably never seen sunlight. I followed one hand on the wall to keep balance. The air inside was cooler still. A few feet in the space widened just enough for 2 people to crouch. That's when my light caught something pale near the far corner. I thought it was a fallen branch until I saw the shape of a hand. He was curled on his side as if he'd lain down to rest. Time had reduced him to bone and faded fabric, but the color still showed a dark navy fleece torn at the sleeve. Beside him lay a cracked leather wallet, edges warped, but contents intact. I picked it up, carefully opened it under the flashlight. A driver's license, brittle but legible, Victor Langley. For a while, no one said anything. The only sound was water dripping somewhere in the dark. I'd done this job long enough to know when to move slow. We photographed everything, logged every angle. The paramedic Lena examined what was left of the bones. The skull showed a fracture high on the temple, the pelvis shattered, a fall from height maybe 20 or 30 feet. Survivable for a while if you were lucky, fatal if you weren't. He must have crawled in here seeking shelter, hoping rescue would find him. I remember kneeling beside him and noticing how neatly everything seemed placed the pack to one side. The broken pocket knife nearby, the thermos now explained. But there was no second body, no sign of Elise. That absence hit harder than the find itself. She had been with him when they set out. The trail photo proved that. If he'd fallen, where had she gone? We widened the search radius around the fissure, combing every ledge and ravine. All we found was a small metal tin half buried in silt, the kind trappers use to keep line grease or matches. The surface was rusted and scratched with the initials CB. It didn't belong to the Langleys, too rough, too out of place. I bagged it, marked the coordinates, and made a note to cross-check the initials against old citations. That night, we hauled Victor's remains out under low cloud cover. It was a long climb, silent, except for rope sliding through pulleys and the rasp of our breathing. Back at the staging area, I called Marissa. She didn't speak for a full 10 seconds after I told her. When she finally did, her voice was small but steady. She said she was on the next flight out. I hung up and stared at the thermos we'd recovered earlier, still gleaming under the lantern. For 3 years it had sat in darkness somewhere above that gorge, waiting for a storm big enough to set it free. Maybe the mountain was giving us pieces in its own time. The lab results on the metal tin came back 2 days later. Traces of mineral oil tobacco and old soil, nothing fancy, just the kind of residue you find on gear used by men who live off the land. I pulled up citation records and scanned for those initials. One name matched Caleb Brantley, local trapper, fined in 2010 for setting snares inside the park boundary. No fixed address, no listed relatives. The year after the Langleys vanished, he'd disappeared too. Some folks said he'd moved west to chase work. Others claimed he'd struck it rich selling rare timber. Either way, he'd left no forwarding trail. Marissa arrived the next morning pale from travel but composed. She identified her father's wallet and confirmed the fleece. When I showed her the tin, she frowned, said it wasn't theirs. That night the story hit the news again, headlines spinning theories faster than we could stamp them out. Murder business enemies stage disappearances. None of it sat right with me. Whatever happened up there felt more intimate, more desperate. I couldn't let it rest. If Victor had died in that cave, Elise either fled or was taken. The thermos and tin were breadcrumbs pointing towards something buried deeper. I spent the next week combing old maps of Devil's Hollow, tracing the flood paths Dr. Monroe had modeled. One line caught my eye, a secondary drainage that would have escaped the 2014 slide. If another cave existed upstream, it might have stayed sealed when the first one opened. We went back with a smaller team, just me, Nate, and Lena. It was the 6th day when we found it, hidden behind a lattice of roots no bigger than a crawl space. The ground inside was disturbed dirt, pushed outward as if something had been dragged. Near the edge, half buried in moss, was a single earring, a silver hoop with a green stone glinting in the flashlight beam. I radioed it in. Later, when Marissa arrived, she recognized it immediately. A gift her father had given Elise years ago. The matching one had been in her jewelry box at home. That night I sat by the camp stove listening to the hiss of boiling water and staring at that earring under a plastic evidence lid. Each clue felt like the forest feeding us one thread at a time. But where it was leading I didn't know yet. The initials on the tin, the missing woman, the vanished trapper, they were starting to knot together in ways I couldn't quite see. As darkness pressed in, I wrote my notes by lantern light, marking the earring's coordinates beside the first caves. 2 points on a map separated by less than half a mile, but they felt worlds apart. I closed the logbook and looked toward the ridge where the trees swayed in the wind like they were whispering to each other. Somewhere out there, the rest of the story was waiting. And I had the uneasy sense that when we finally found it, it wouldn't just explain what happened, it would change what we thought we knew about mercy and about survival. The morning after we found that earring, fog clung to the ground like smoke from an unseen fire. Every leaf seemed wet to the touch, every sound swallowed before it could travel far. I remember sitting by the camp stove turning that tiny piece of silver over in my hand. It was cold and delicate, the green stone dulled by dirt. Just one earring, but it said enough. Elise had made it out of the first cave alive. Where she'd gone next was the question that had started to eat at me. We'd searched every accessible hollow around Devil's Hollow, mapped the terrain twice, and still hadn't found another body, no trace of her gear, no footprints. It was as if the forest had taken her in and never let her go. That afternoon, I called in to our contacts at the state police, asking for background on Caleb Brantley, the trapper whose initials we'd found scratched into that rusted tin. He'd been cited for illegal snares back in 2010, but dropped off the radar a year later. No forwarding address, no phone, no relatives on record. But someone had logged a minor trespassing complaint under his name in 2013, 100 miles west, just over the Ohio border. It wasn't much, but it was something. I made the call to follow it. If Elise had survived the fall, she'd needed help, and Brantley might have been the one who found her. Whether he saved her or something worse, that was what we had to learn. We made the drive early the next morning. The road cut through a seam of fog and pine, the kind of stretch where radio static turns to silence. Nate sat beside me studying the old case notes, while I watched the mile markers tick by. The farther we got from West Virginia, the flatter the land became, rolling into low hills and empty fields. When we finally turned down the gravel track leading to Brantley's cabin, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the same one I get before every knock that might end a case. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. A dog barked from a chain near the porch, low and steady. I parked far enough back to give us space to move if things went bad. 2 troopers followed behind in an unmarked SUV. We didn't go in heavy, no flashing lights, no drawn weapons, just a conversation. At least that's how I wanted it to start. I told Nate to stay close but let me lead. The boards creaked under my boots as I climbed the steps. I knocked twice. The door opened a few inches, and a man's face appeared lean, weathered, with eyes that had seen too many winters. Caleb Brantley looked older than his file photo. His beard was streaked gray, his hands calloused, one resting near the handle of a hunting knife on his belt. I told him who we were, that we were investigating a missing persons case connected to Monongahela. He didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked between me and the troopers measuring distance, calculating risk. "What's this about?" he asked finally, voice rough from years without much use. I set the evidence bag on the small table near the door. Inside was that tin we'd found. "We pulled this from a cave in Devil's Hollow," I said. "Ring any bells?" He took one look, and the color drained from his face. His thumb brushed the edge of the plastic like he was touching an old wound. "Where'd you say you found that?" he muttered, eyes dropping. "Same ridge where a man's remains turned up. Victor Langley." "You were in that area back in 2011, I said quietly. "We need to know what happened." He leaned against the doorframe, shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. For a long time I thought he'd shut down, but then he exhaled a shaky sound like air leaving a cracked pipe. "I didn't kill nobody," he said. The words came slow, trembling. "It was an accident." I told him to start from the beginning, and he did, voice hollow but steady enough to hold. He said he'd been running trap lines off the ridge that day, same as always. Late afternoon, he heard what sounded like an avalanche of rock, a crash, then silence. When he climbed toward it, he found a man at the base of a cliff, twisted up, bad leg broken, bleeding. The man said his name was Victor, said his wife was higher up, that she'd fallen too, but wasn't moving. Caleb said he climbed up, found her a short distance away, unconscious but breathing. He built a makeshift shelter under an overhang, dragged them both there, used the contents of that tin bandages, salve, whatever he had to patch what he could. "He didn't make it through the night," he whispered. "The woman, she woke up, didn't know who she was, didn't remember nothing. I panicked, thought they'd pin it on me if I called it in. I buried him shallow, marked the spot with rocks, and took her back to my camp. She didn't even know her own name, so I called her Anna." His eyes went to the window when he said it. "She was good," he murmured. "Quiet, gentle, helped me with chores. We kept to ourselves. I didn't mean for it to go on that long. I could feel the weight of the troopers' eyes on me, waiting for a signal. I didn't give one." "Is she still here?" I asked. He nodded toward the back of the house. "Out in the garden," he said softly. "She thinks that's her home." I motioned for the troopers to stay calm and stepped aside as he called out for her. The back door opened, and a woman appeared, wiping dirt from her hands onto an apron. Her hair, streaked with gray, caught the morning light, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. It was Elise, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. She looked at us with a polite curiosity, no recognition, just a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Company?" she asked, her voice gentle, uncertain. I held out the small evidence bag with the earring inside. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. She studied it, brow furrowing. "It's pretty," she said. Why, I told her softly, "It belonged to you." Then I showed her a printed photo of her and Victor, the one from that last day on the trail. For a few seconds she just stared, lips parting, slightly eyes flicking between the picture and the ground. Then something broke. Her shoulders trembled and she brought a hand to her mouth. "That's me," she whispered. "That's him." Caleb stood frozen, jaw tight, eyes glassy. I stepped closer, told her we'd get her medical help, that she wasn't in trouble, that we just wanted her safe. The rest of it unfolded quietly, almost mercifully. Backup arrived. Caleb didn't fight. He didn't even reach for the knife. He just turned his hands over and let the cuffs click into place. I remember him saying one last thing before they let him out. "I thought I was doing right," he said, voice breaking. "I couldn't lose another soul to that mountain." At the hospital in Chillicothe, Elise was examined and placed under observation. The doctors called it post-traumatic amnesia, a fog brought on by head injury and shock. For 3 years, she'd lived under another name, tending a garden she thought was hers, believing her old life had never existed. When Marissa arrived and walked into that room, she stopped dead at the sight of her mother sitting up in the hospital bed, thin hands folded in her lap. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Marissa crossed the room, and Elise reached out, fingers trembling, and they just held on. No words could touch it. I stood outside the door watching through the glass and thought about Victor, the way he must have dragged himself into that cave, trying to save her. About Caleb, afraid and isolated, trying to fix what he'd broken by keeping her hidden. The forest had taken them all in different ways. A few days later, I sat through Caleb's interview at the county jail. He didn't ask for a lawyer, just wanted to explain. He said he'd tried to take Elise to a ranger station once but turned back when she panicked, convinced she was being chased. She didn't remember her name, he said, staring at the table. Didn't remember the man she loved. I told myself it was mercy leaving it alone. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know it was wrong. When the court date came, Elise insisted on testifying. She stood there, voice fragile but steady, telling the judge that Caleb had saved her life, that he'd been scared but kind. He made a terrible mistake, she said, but he kept me alive when no one else was there. The judge gave him probation instead of prison. By then, he was a shell of a man anyway. He nodded, said thank you, and walked out into a world that had forgotten his name. That evening, after the hearing, I found myself back in the forest, different trail, same wind through the spruce. The air smelled of rain and pine, and the mountains loomed like quiet witnesses. I thought about all the years we'd searched, the thousands of dollars spent, the prayers said over empty ground, and how the answer had been living quietly in a cabin 2 states away. I don't know if that was justice, but it was truth, and sometimes that's the most the world will give you. When I drove home that night, the last of the daylight was fading behind the hills. I rolled down the window and let the cold come in, listening to the hum of the tires on the road. Somewhere behind me in that hospital room, a mother and daughter were learning how to be family again. And somewhere out in the dark, a man who had tried to hide from the world was finally facing it. Still, I couldn't shake one thought: the forest had given back what it owed, but only when it was ready. And in its silence, there were still things we hadn't found. I didn't know it yet, but the mountain wasn't done speaking. The courtroom emptied out slow that afternoon, the kind of slow that feels like the air itself has weight. I watched Caleb Brantley step through the side door in his old work boots, wrists free, now his head bowed under the ceiling lights. Elise sat in the front row beside her daughter, her hand wrapped around Marissa's. They didn't look at him when he passed. Maybe they couldn't. Or maybe they'd already decided that what needed to be forgiven had already been. When the door shut behind him, the sound echoed through the room like the end of a long storm. I stood in the back, leaning on the rail, feeling the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from knowing the truth finally has nowhere else to go. Afterward, we walked out into the parking lot together. It was early spring by then, gray sky air, heavy with the smell of thawing earth. Elise was quiet, eyes on the clouds, as if she was still half expecting them to turn into trees. She asked if Victor's remains would be buried back in West Virginia. I told her yes. Marissa had made arrangements for a small ceremony near Spruce Knob, not far from the trail they'd started on. He'd like that, she said softly. Then after a pause, he always said the mountains felt like home. A few weeks later, I drove out there for the service. It was a short, one small circle of people standing in jackets and scarves, while a ranger's flag rippled in the wind. The ground was soft and dark, the kind that gives under your boots. Marissa spoke for a few minutes, voice steady but quiet, thanking the teams that had searched for years, thanking the volunteers who never stopped showing up. When she stepped back, Elise walked forward with a handful of wildflowers. She laid them at the headstone, fingers lingering a little longer than she probably meant to. The inscription was simple: Victor Langley, 1959 to 2011. The mountain kept his silence, but not forever. I stood off to the side, hands in my pockets, listening to the wind move through the spruce trees. The sound was soft, but constant, like breath. And for the first time in a long time, the place didn't feel hostile, just honest. Elise stayed in the hospital a few more months, working through therapy first to help her memory, then to help her live with what she remembered. The doctors said fragments would always be missing, small blanks her mind might never fill. But she remembered Victor. She remembered their life together. And that was enough. When she was discharged, she and Marissa sold the family's condo in Pittsburgh and moved to a quiet town near the edge of the forest. They didn't go back to real estate. Instead, they started a small foundation in Victor's name to support search and rescue training. Every year, they fund a handful of new volunteers, teaching them how to read terrain, how to listen for things the forest doesn't want to share. I like to think that's their way of giving something back to the mountain that took so much from them. As for Caleb, he kept his word, served his probation, quietly stayed out of sight. Last I heard, he moved farther south to a piece of land near the river where he could trap legally. The judge had allowed him to keep his cabin, but he never went back. He left it empty, save for a small garden out back and a few rusted tools. A deputy told me once that when they went to check on the place, there was still a teacup on the table and a row of dried herbs hanging by the window. It looked like someone had just stepped out and forgotten to come home. I retired not long after the case closed. 30 years in uniform was enough. These days, I live in a modest house a few miles outside Elkins. My mornings are quiet now, coffee on the porch, the smell of pine and wet grass, the radio humming just enough to fill the silence. But there isn't a week that goes by that I don't think about the Langleys or the way a single storm and a single wrong step can rearrange so many lives. I think about how long the forest kept its secret, how stubborn it was, and how even after all those years, the truth didn't come with triumph. It came with a whisper. People sometimes ask me if I ever found peace after that. I tell them peace isn't something you find. It's something that visits. It shows up for a few minutes when you're not expecting it, like when the sun breaks through fog over the ridge or when you hear the first spring peepers calling from the marsh. Then it moves on. What stays behind is acceptance, and maybe that's close enough. Every so often Marissa calls, usually in the fall when the leaves start to turn and the foundation hosts its annual training weekend. She tells me about the new recruits, about the drones they use now to scan the ridges, and about the families who come out to watch the demonstrations. Last year, she said, Elise gave a short speech, her first public one since the accident. She told the crowd that the forest didn't steal her life, it just rewrote it. The mountain gave me back what I lost, she said. Not in the same form, but enough to go on. I've thought about that line more times than I can count. Enough to go on. It's strange how survival works. It's not about being rescued, it's about learning how to live in the aftermath when the story stops being loud and starts being quiet again. The official file sits in a cabinet at the ranger station, one drawer down from where I keep my personal journals. Sometimes when a young ranger joins the staff, they ask about the Langley case. I'll tell them a version of it. Not the whole thing, just enough to remind them that every trail holds its own kind of truth, and not every disappearance ends in tragedy or malice. Some end in confusion and mercy, tangled together so tightly you can't tell them apart. There's a new wooden sign out near Devil's Hollow now. It warns about unstable terrain, loose shale, and sudden weather shifts. But underneath that, there's a small brass plaque placed there by the Langley Foundation. It reads, "In memory of those who wander too far and of those who go looking anyway." The first time I saw it, I stood there for a long while, hand resting on the post. The wind came through the trees, and I could swear it carried a faint scent of rain, even though the sky was clear. I thought about how many nights I'd walked these woods calling their names into the dark, never knowing that she was still alive somewhere just out of reach. People imagine closure as a clean line, the point where everything ends neatly. But it isn't like that. Closure is a gradual thing. It's finding your balance after years of leaning into grief. It's learning to live with the sound of wind in the branches without hearing echoes of the ones you lost. It's the small peace that comes when you realize that remembering and moving on aren't opposites. They're the same act done at different speeds. When I go hiking now, I keep to easier trails, the kind with clear markers and steady footing. I still carry a compass, though the GPS in my truck makes it unnecessary. Old habits die hard. Sometimes I stop at a ridge and look out over miles of green and shadow, and I wonder how many other stories are still buried somewhere out there, how many clues sit under moss or stone, waiting for a storm to bring them back. The forest doesn't forget. It just holds things until someone asks the right way. It's been over a decade since that call came through, the one from a daughter whose parents were late for dinner. I can still hear her voice in my memory, quiet but urgent. I can still see her standing by that motel door under the neon sign, waiting for headlights that never appeared. And I can still feel the moment years later when she hugged her mother for the first time after thinking she was gone forever. Those are the moments that stay even after the reports are filed and the evidence sealed. That's the real record, the one the earth keeps. So when people ask me why I still tell this story, I tell them it's because silence is how things get lost. Remembering is how they come back. And some names, no matter how long they've been buried under time or moss or guilt, deserve to be spoken out loud. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because out there in those quiet woods, the wind still moves through the spruce, whispering reminders of the people it once held and of the few it decided at last to return.